There's this specific kind of exhaustion that comes from checking your savings account for the third time this week and seeing basically the same number you saw 3 months ago. You're working, you're trying to be responsible, you're not even spending money on anything ridiculous, but somehow that balance just hovers there, barely moving, like you're trying to fill a swimming pool with a garden hose. And meanwhile, you keep hearing about this magical six-figure milestone, $100,000, like it's some kind of financial promised land where everything suddenly gets easier. But when you do the math in your head, when you calculate how long it would take to save that much at your current rate, the timeline stretches so far into the future that you might as well be planning for retirement on Mars. Here's what nobody tells you about that first 100,000. It's not actually about the money. Not really. It's about crossing a psychological threshold where your relationship with saving fundamentally transforms, where you stop feeling like you're pushing a boulder uphill and start feeling like you've built something with momentum, something that moves on its own. My name's Anderson, and I've spent years studying not just how people save money, but why most people fail at it despite having every intention of succeeding. And what I've discovered is this. The strategies that actually work have almost nothing to do with cutting out lattes or bringing lunch from home. Those things might save you a few $100s a year. What I'm talking about can save you tens of thousands, entire years off your timeline. But here's the catch. Most of what you've been told about building savings is designed to keep you focused on small optimizations while ignoring the structural decisions that actually determine whether you succeed or spend the next decade spinning your wheels. Let me show you what actually matters. Here's what most people believe about saving money. They think it's a discipline problem, that if they just had more willpower, more control, more determination, they'd be able to sock away enough money to hit their goals. So they focus on restriction, on sacrifice, on making their financial life smaller and smaller until they're living like they're in some kind of voluntary poverty program. And then they burn out, because no one can sustain that forever. No one can white-knuckle their way through years of deprivation without eventually cracking and spending money they shouldn't spend, which triggers guilt, which leads to more spending, which creates a cycle that keeps them stuck exactly where they started. But here's the contrarian truth that changes everything. The first 100,000 isn't hard because you lack discipline. It's hard because you're fighting with the wrong tools. Most people approach saving like they're trying to win a war with tactics when they should be focusing on strategy. They're optimizing $10 decisions while ignoring $1,000 structures. They're tracking every expense in some app while their housing costs are destroying 40% of their income. They're clipping digital coupons while financing a car they can't afford. The wealthy don't save money through superior willpower. They save money through superior systems, through structural decisions that make saving automatic rather than optional, through understanding which financial levers actually move the needle and which ones are just theater. Once you understand this, once you shift from tactics to strategy, the timeline to 100,000 compresses dramatically. We're not talking about decades, we're talking about years. Maybe 5, maybe 7. Depends on where you're starting and which structural changes you're willing to make. But the transformation isn't just about speed. It's about what happens psychologically when you stop feeling like saving is something you're forcing yourself to do and start feeling like you're building something inevitable. Here's the invisible threshold that most people never cross. It's the point where your savings generate enough growth that you can see it happening in real time, where compound interest stops being an abstract concept and becomes a visible force in your account. When you have $5,000 saved, a 7% annual return generates about $350 per year. Helpful, but barely noticeable. You're not checking your account excited to see how much your investment's earned. You're checking it hoping you haven't accidentally overspent. When you have $20,000 saved, that same return generates $1,400 annually. Better, but still feels like you're doing all the work. Every dollar in that account came from your paycheck. Your contributions dwarf whatever returns you're seeing. But at 100,000, that 7% return generates $7,000 annually. That's real money. That's a month and a half of median American income appearing in your account without you working for it. Your money is finally pulling weight. This is the threshold where psychology shifts from scarcity to momentum, where you stop feeling like you're trying to catch up to some impossible goal and start feeling like you've built a machine that produces money while you sleep. And once you cross that line, something interesting happens. The second 100,000 comes faster than the first. Not because you're suddenly earning more or saving more aggressively, but because your existing capital is compounding. The foundation is working. This is why everyone who's built wealth tells you the first 100,000 is the hardest. They're not trying to discourage you. They're telling you the truth. You're building momentum from zero, and that's always the hardest phase. But momentum, once established, carries you forward with less effort than starting required. Let me show you what changes psychologically when you go from having nothing saved to having real capital accumulated, because this shift is more profound than most people realize. When you have no savings, you're operating in pure survival mode. Every financial decision is made under pressure. Car trouble isn't an inconvenience, it's a crisis. Unexpected medical bills aren't problems to solve, they're potential catastrophes that might require debt. Job loss isn't a career setback, it's existential threat. In this mode, your brain isn't thinking strategically. It can't. It's too busy managing immediate threats. You make short-term decisions that feel necessary in the moment but cost you exponentially more in the long run. You finance things you should save for. You take jobs you hate because you can't afford to be selective. You stay in situations that are slowly destroying you because leaving feels financially impossible. But when you have substantial savings, something fundamental shifts. Not because you're suddenly wealthy, you're not, but because you've created space between yourself and disaster. That space changes how your brain processes everything. Car trouble? Annoying, but you handle it. Medical bill, you pay it without panic. Job loss, you have months to find something good instead of days to find anything. You're not making decisions from desperation anymore, you're making them from evaluation, and that distinction is everything. This is when people start noticing that their career trajectory changes, not because they suddenly got smarter or more skilled, but because they're negotiating from stability instead of fear. They're turning down opportunities that don't align with their goals instead of accepting whatever's offered. They're advocating for themselves instead of being grateful for whatever they can get. Your posture shifts. Everyone can sense it, even if they can't articulate why. And that shift alone often leads to better outcomes than any amount of tactical optimization ever could. Now let me show you the actual math that makes this work, because understanding these numbers changes everything about how you approach saving. Let's say you're making $60,000 annually and you manage to save 20% of your income. That's $12,000 per year, or $1,000 per month. At that rate, hitting $100,000 takes about 8 years if your money just sits in a savings account earning nothing. 8 years feels impossible. That's why most people never start. But here's what changes when you invest that money instead of just saving it. At a conservative 7% annual return, that same $12,000 per year gets you to $100,000 in just over 7 years. You've shaved almost a year off the timeline just by investing instead of hoarding cash. Now let's say you focus on one structural change. We'll get to what that might be in a moment. That frees up another $5,000 annually. Now you're saving $17,000 per year instead of $12,000. That changes your timeline to just under 5 years. 5 years. From financially fragile to having substantial capital. From operating in survival mode to having breathing room. From making decisions out of desperation to making them from choice. That's not overnight wealth. That's not some get-rich scheme. That's just math combined with structural thinking, and it's faster than most people ever imagined possible. But here's where it gets really interesting. Once you hit $100,000, if you maintain that same $17,000 annual contribution, You reach 200,000 in about 4 years instead of 5. The second 100,000 comes 20% faster than the first, purely because of compound growth. At 300,000, you're generating 21,000 annually in returns at that 7% rate. Your money is earning more than you're contributing. You've reached the tipping point where capital does more work than labor. This is the acceleration effect. This is why the first 100,000 matters so much. Not because it makes you rich, but because it's the foundation that makes everything after it faster. And here's where the identity shift happens that separates people who build wealth from people who just temporarily have money. When you're starting from zero, you're someone who's trying to save, someone who's making sacrifices, someone who's deferring gratification. Your identity is built around restriction and discipline, around saying no, but somewhere around 50 or 60,000 saved, something changes. You're not trying to be a saver anymore. You are a saver. This isn't something you're doing, it's something you've become. The behavior has integrated into your identity so completely that it no longer requires conscious effort. You stop negotiating with yourself about whether to save this month. The money leaves your account automatically, and what's left is what you have to work with. You've stopped thinking of your gross income as your money and started thinking of it as revenue that gets allocated according to a system you designed. This identity shift is permanent. People who reach this stage rarely go backwards because they've fundamentally changed how they relate to money. They're not performing discipline anymore. They're operating from structure. And that distinction is why some people build wealth that lasts while others just have temporary windfalls that evaporate. Now, let's talk about what most financial advice gets catastrophically wrong: the obsession with small optimizations while ignoring large structural decisions. Everyone tells you to cut the small stuff, stop buying coffee, cancel subscriptions, bring lunch from home, shop sales, use coupons, and sure, these things add up. Maybe you save $2,000 a year if you're really diligent about it. But $2,000 per year, even invested well, adds maybe $15,000 to your net worth over 7 years. That's real money, but it's not life-changing money. Meanwhile, nobody wants to talk about the big structural decisions because they're uncomfortable. They require real change rather than just optimization around the edges. Let's talk about housing. For most people, this is 35 to 45% of their income. Let's say you're spending $2,000 per month on rent because you live alone in a decent neighborhood in a medium-cost city. If you get a roommate and split a slightly larger place, you might drop your share to $1,200. That's $800 per month, almost $10,000 per year. Over 7 years, invested properly, that's nearly $90,000 in additional net worth. One decision, one structural change, almost as impactful as a decade of optimizing small purchases or transportation. The average new car payment in America is over $600 monthly. Over 7 years, that's $50,000 in payments. But a reliable used vehicle might cost $200 monthly in payments and maintenance. That 3-year-old Honda isn't sexy, but it saves you $400 per month. That's nearly $40,000 invested over 7 years. These are the decisions that actually move the needle. These are the structural changes that compress timelines from decades to years. But most people can't bring themselves to make them because they've conflated lifestyle with identity. They think living in a nicer place alone or driving a newer car says something about their worth as a person. So they stay trapped in expensive structures while optimizing $10 decisions and wondering why they never get ahead. Here's something else that changes when you have substantial savings. Your relationship with work transforms entirely. When you have nothing saved, you need your job desperately. You can't afford to lose it. You can't afford to negotiate hard. You can't afford to be selective about opportunities. You take what you can get and you're grateful for it, even when the situation is slowly destroying you. But when you have 60 or 80,000 saved, not enough to retire on, not even close, but enough to live on for a year or more, everything shifts. Suddenly you can afford to be strategic. You can turn down opportunities that don't align with your long-term goals. You can negotiate more aggressively because walking away is an actual option rather than a bluff. You can take calculated career risks that might have massive upside because the downside is manageable. This isn't about having fuck you money in any dramatic sense. This is about having enough cushion that you're making decisions from evaluation rather than desperation. And that shift alone often leads to better career outcomes than any amount of networking or resume optimization ever could. People can sense when you're operating from stability versus fear. Hiring managers, clients, colleagues, they all pick up on it, even if they can't articulate what they're detecting, and they respond differently. Better opportunities flow to people who seem like they have options, regardless of whether they're actually using those options or not. But here's the warning I need you to hear clearly, because this is where most people sabotage themselves right when they're on the verge of breaking through. The first time your savings account crosses 50,000 or 70,000 or 90,000, whenever you see that number getting substantial, there's this voice that starts whispering. It says, "You've been so disciplined, you've sacrificed so much, you deserve to reward yourself, you've earned this." And maybe you start thinking about upgrades, new car, better apartment, vacation you've been postponing, something that feels like a reward for all the discipline you've shown. This is the trap that keeps people stuck at 70 or 80,000 for years, because what you're actually doing when you reward yourself for hitting these milestones is resetting your timeline. You're breaking momentum right when it's about to carry you forward effortlessly. That $10,000 car upgrade doesn't just cost you $10,000, it costs you the compound growth that money would have generated over the next decade. At 7% returns, that's almost $20,000 in lost future value. You didn't spend $10,000, you spent $20,000 from your future self. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They don't see crossing savings milestones as achievements to celebrate through consumption. They see them as proof that their system is working and ammunition to keep the system running. The reward for reaching 60,000 saved isn't buying something nice. The reward is reaching 100,000 faster. The reward is hitting the acceleration phase where compound growth starts doing meaningful work. The reward is building financial freedom, not celebrating progress toward it. Let me show you one more piece that ties this all together: the opportunity cost of every major financial decision at this stage. When you're building your first 100,000, every dollar you spend on something that depreciates is a dollar you're not investing in something that appreciates. And because of compound growth, that trade-off is exponentially more expensive than it appears. Let's say you finance a $30,000 car. You're thinking about the monthly payment, maybe $450 per month, and whether you can fit that into your budget. But you're not thinking about what that same $450 would become if you invested it instead. Over the 5 years of car payments, that's $27,000 you're spending. But if you invested that same money at 7% returns, it would be worth about $32,000 by the time the car is paid off. And the car, it's worth maybe $15,000 now. You're down $17,000 from where you could have been. But let's keep going. That $32,000 left invested for another 20 years becomes about $123,000. That car didn't cost you $30,000. It cost you $108,000 in future wealth for transportation that you could have gotten for a fraction of that cost. I'm not saying never buy anything. I'm not saying live like a monk. I'm saying understand what you're actually trading when you make these decisions. Run the math on what that purchase costs in future value, not just present dollars. Then decide if it's worth it. Sometimes it is. Sometimes present quality of life genuinely justifies future trade-offs. But most of the time, when people actually see the real cost, they make different choices. So here's where we end up. The first 100,000 isn't about perfect budgeting or superior willpower. It's about making a few structural decisions that actually move the needle while most people are focused on optimizing around the edges. It's about understanding that housing, transportation, and lifestyle inflation are the levers that matter, not coffee and lunch. It's about recognizing that investing beats saving, that compound growth rewards time more than it rewards anything else, and that momentum, once established, does more work than discipline ever could. Most people will keep doing what they've always done. They'll track every expense, they'll feel guilty about small purchases, they'll make marginal optimizations while ignoring the structural decisions that actually determine outcomes. And they'll spend the next decade wondering why they never get ahead despite doing everything right. But some people, maybe you will actually shift their thinking. You'll look at your housing costs and ask if there's a way to cut them by 30%, even temporarily. You'll look at your car payment and question whether that monthly burden is worth what it's costing in future freedom. You'll start thinking in terms of structure rather than tactics. And 5 or 6 years from now, you'll check your account and see 6 figures, and it won't feel like magic. It'll feel inevitable, like the natural result of decisions you made when they were hard because you understood where they would lead. 20 years from now, when you're making decisions from financial stability rather than pressure, when your investments are generating more income than most people earn from work, you'll look back on this exact moment. The moment when you understood what actually matters. And you'll be grateful, not because the journey was easy, not because you got lucky, but because you made structural decisions that most people avoid, and you protected your momentum long enough for compound growth to take over. You built something that lasts, not because you had superior willpower, but because you had superior understanding of which decisions actually matter. That's the difference. That's always been the difference. And now you know.